Counting on alum Jinger Duggar is back participating in interviews following the release of her new book, People Pleaser. Jinger has been open regarding exposing the harmful teachings of the IBLP. However, Jinger surprised many with the new detail she shared, where she thought her husband would leave her if she didn't comply. Keep reading to see her statements. Counting on Jinger Duggar back in NYC for book's release. Jinger recently took to Instagram to share her touchdown in NYC to release her book, People Pleaser. This was the second time Jinger landed in NYC to launch a memoir. In January 2023, the Counting on alum released her first book, Becoming Free Indeed, which features her disentanglement from the questionable teachings of the IBLP. Jinger's new title, People Pleaser, will showcase how she was able to break free from living up to the expectations of others. It will also tell parts of her childhood to early adulthood, where she struggled to identify herself. Jinger taught husband will leave if she didn't comply. Jinger Duggar recently had an interview where she shared another questionable teaching of the IBLP. According to the Counting on alum, her previous church would tell women to obey their husbands at any cost, or they would leave them. She continued, "I will just say a lot of it started when I was in the teachings of Bill Gothard, because there was so much that was drilled into you through what he said about trying to please your husband, and if you don't, he's going to leave you." Another reason they were told to was if they left the house dirty or didn't make dinner for their husband. She added, "Or you're not joyfully available to him at all times," before saying it was also focused on, do this, do this, do this, do this, otherwise you're not going to be enough for him. Counting on Jinger Duggar assures her stories are real. During the same interview, Jinger Duggar said that she wrote People Pleaser as accurately as possible, adding that the stories were very raw. The Counting on alum continued, "People can take them as they will. In my mind, I was like, okay, I want to be as open and vulnerable as I can be, because that is part of the need that we see." Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar have yet to share their comments on Jinger's book, but sources claim that Jim Bob wasn't a fan of some of his daughter's books. One of them was Jill's Counting the Cost. It talked about his dark secrets, including his alleged lies about the family's income from the reality show. Jinger Duggar's heart raced as the sound of the airplane wheels hitting the tarmac echoed in her ears. She had just landed in New York City for the launch of her second book, People Pleaser, and though excitement bubbled within her, there was also an undercurrent of anxiety. This book, unlike her first one, was deeply personal. It was raw, it was vulnerable, and it would challenge everything she had ever been taught. For years, Jinger had lived under the shadow of the teachings of the Institute in Basic Life Principles, IBLP, an organization led by Bill Gothard, whose influence had shaped her childhood and early adult life. Her family's strict adherence to its teachings had created an environment where control and compliance were paramount, especially for women. As a child, Jinger had always been told to obey. It was woven into the fabric of her being. Obey your parents, obey your leaders, obey your husband. But what did it mean to truly obey? And what happened when the constant pressure to please and to perform became suffocating? The flight had given her a chance to reflect on how far she had come since those years. As a teenager, Jinger had been the obedient daughter, the one who tried to follow all the rules, no matter how impossible or unreasonable they seemed. And when she married Jeremy Volo, she had hoped that the strict expectations of her upbringing would ease. She had hoped that she could forge a new life, a different path. But what she didn't realize was how deeply the lessons of submission had been ingrained in her psyche. "Jeremy will leave me if I don't do this right," Jinger had once whispered to herself, fighting back tears. It was one of the many thoughts that had plagued her during the early days of her marriage. It wasn't something she had ever questioned. After all, in her mind, her worth as a wife, as a woman, was tied to her ability to meet the expectations of those around her, especially her husband. This was the same teaching that had been drilled into her by the IBLP, especially by Bill Gothard himself. She recalled his teachings clearly. A woman's role is to support and serve her husband. If she doesn't, if she fails to keep the house in perfect order or fails to be available to him at all times, she will fail as a wife, and if she fails, he might leave her. Those words had echoed in her head for years, even long after she left the IBLP's teachings behind. She had tried to follow those rules, even after realizing that they were not only unrealistic, but also harmful. "I just thought I wasn't enough," Jinger said during an interview, her voice trembling slightly. "If I didn't keep the house spotless, make sure Jeremy's dinner was perfect, or always be cheerful and available, I felt like I was failing him. But what I didn't realize then was that I was also failing myself." The idea that her marriage could be jeopardized by something as trivial as not keeping the house in perfect order or failing to meet an arbitrary standard of availability haunted her. There were moments when she felt overwhelmed by the need to perform, to prove her worthiness in a way that was dictated by someone else's rules. Yet, as the years passed and as Jinger learned more about herself, she began to question these teachings. The release of her first book, Becoming Free Indeed, had marked a pivotal moment in her journey. She had begun to shed the layers of expectation placed on her by the IBLP and her family. But People Pleaser was different. In this book, Jinger didn't just tell the story of her spiritual awakening. She dug deeper into the painful reality of what it had been like to grow up under the constant pressure to please and to comply. She had lived with the fear that if she didn't meet the expectations set for her, she would lose the love and approval of the people she held most dear. Her words were raw and unfiltered as she described how the fear of rejection had affected her marriage. "I thought that if I didn't do everything perfectly, Jeremy would leave me," Jinger admitted. "The pressure to be a perfect wife was overwhelming. It was a fear that lingered in the back of my mind, even when I knew deep down that my husband didn't want me to be perfect. He wanted me to be me." It was through this realization that Jinger began to break free from the chains of people-pleasing. She had to confront the lie that her worth was dependent on her ability to meet someone else's standards. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the old habits of trying to make everyone happy would surface. But with time, Jinger learned to embrace the freedom that came with self-acceptance. As she walked through the streets of New York City, preparing for the next interview about her book, Jinger felt a sense of empowerment. She had written People Pleaser not to shame her past, but to share her journey of healing. She wanted to help others who had been trapped by similar pressures, to show them that they were worthy of love and acceptance, just as they were. Jinger's book was not just about her experience within the IBLP. It was about breaking free from a toxic cycle of perfectionism and fear. She wanted women, especially those raised in strict religious environments, to know that they were more than their ability to please others. They were enough, just as they were. Her vulnerability in sharing these intimate details about her marriage, her fears, and her personal growth was not without its risks. Her family, particularly her parents, Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar, had yet to comment publicly on her book. It was no secret that they held different views, especially when it came to the IBLP's teachings. Jim Bob, in particular, had shown disapproval of the books written by his daughters that criticized their upbringing. But Jinger knew that her path to healing was not about pleasing anyone else. It was about being true to herself. She had spent too many years conforming to the expectations of others. Now, she was finally free to tell her story, to help others, and to live a life defined by her own choices. As she walked into the building for her next interview, Jinger couldn't help but smile. She was no longer the young girl afraid of losing her husband's love or approval. She was a woman who had learned to love herself first, and that, she knew, was the truest form of freedom. Her journey was far from over, but with each word she wrote, with each conversation she had, Jinger was reclaiming her power. and it felt like nothing short of liberation.